1 o'clock news from the BBC with Philip Hayton.
Good afternoon. The death toll in the M1 air crash is now 43. More than 80 people were rescued from the wreckage alive. A fire chief said that was a miracle. The plane crashed only yards from the runway lights and only seconds from safety. The seriously injured pilot has been praised for his efforts to save his stricken plane. And survivors have told of the flight's last moments.
So we braced our heads, and about 5 seconds, I would have said afterwards, we were down on the ground with a crash, all the lights were out, and we seemed to be at an angle of about 45 with the vertical.
One chance in 10 million. Those are the odds against both engines failing on an aircraft, according to one of Britain's senior crash investigators. And yet, it could have been that fatal coincidence which caused last night's air crash in Leicestershire. The British Midlands plane was carrying 118 passengers and 8 crew. 43 of the passengers are now dead, and many of the survivors, including the pilot, are seriously injured in hospital. The Transport Secretary, Paul Channon, has ordered a full inquiry, and 9 of his investigators have already started work. They'll be joined by experts from Boeing, who made the plane, a 737-400 series, and from General Electric and Snecma, who jointly produced the engines. The plane which crashed was virtually brand new, the first in Europe to use the new technology CFM56 engines. It had taken off from Heathrow shortly before 8 o'clock yesterday evening, bound for Belfast. One engine caught fire. The pilot diverted to East Midlands Airport. Then, as the Boeing approached the runway, close by the village of Kegworth, reports indicate that its other engine may have failed. It crashed into woodland on a steep embankment beside the M1, leaving its undercarriage trailing across the motorway. Our first report by Mike Smart is from there.
Just how close the captain of British Midland Flight BD92 got to the runway at East Midlands Airport and to saving his stricken aircraft and passengers could be seen at daylight, as accident investigators began to try and answer the crucial question: how could both engines on a brand new aircraft fail with such disastrous results? Last night, just before 8:30, the Boeing 737, with just 500 flying hours on the clock, smashed into a motorway embankment. Firemen, standing by for an emergency landing, were on the scene within minutes, spraying the fuselage to prevent the aircraft bursting into flames or exploding. At the same time, the task of rescuing the crew and passengers began. Having identified trouble in one engine early on in the flight, the air crew should have had plenty of time to warn everyone on board of the danger. And experts are saying this morning that preparing passengers for a crash landing may have saved scores of lives. A man returning to Humberside from the boat show was amongst the first on the scene.
It was pretty confusing, really. There's all that metal up there. There's a lot of people obviously trapped inside. The funny part about it was no noise. There was nothing. It was just dead quiet, except for the actual jet foam and everything else, and the sirens and the klaxons going. Other than that, it was very quiet, very eerie. There was nobody sort of calling out or anything. When we got up there, the ambulance men got up, we started passing the people out of the aircraft as best we could. Really surprising how many people came out alive on that back section behind us there. Just unbelievable.
Many of the most seriously injured were given treatment at the crash scene before being carried delicately to a fleet of ambulances from several counties, which took them to a number of hospitals in the area. On the motorway, the less seriously injured, many of whom had been able to walk away from the crash, were kept warm and as comfortable as possible before they too were taken away for treatment. Some of the passengers, though, remained trapped in the fuselage for many hours, and long into the night, time after time, doctors squeezed into the wreckage to help them. 8 hours after the crash, the last of the dead was recovered. Transport Secretary Paul Channon travelled to Leicestershire to visit the scene.
All I'd say at the moment is how deeply sorry I am for those who've been injured and the relatives of those who've been killed. And again, to say how wonderful the emergency services have been, some of whom were in the spot really within only a minute or two.
The disaster could have been worse. Almost incredibly, on Britain's main motorway, there was no vehicle in the immediate vicinity when the plane came down. Air crash investigators started their task amid reports that not only had one of the Boeing's engines caught fire soon after the aircraft had left Heathrow, the other had failed too as it approached the East Midlands airport preparing for an emergency landing. British Midlands chairman was asked about the plane.
It's a completely new aeroplane. It also is a new variant of an existing engine, and like all new products, both the manufacturers and the operators and the Civil Aviation Authority obviously are monitoring the performance of the engine in its early operational life.
But have there been any problems which have emerged so far that you know of?
I can't. The records of the engine and the experience to date are matters which, of course, will all be reviewed by the accident investigation. Certainly the aircraft, as of today, has been operating a number of flights today, and there has been no reported malfunctionings on the aircraft.
Last night's crash comes less than 3 weeks after the Pan American jumbo disaster at Lockerbie. But this morning, the Transport Secretary said there were few, if any, similarities between the two.
The only silver lining is the fact that each of them, the emergency services, have behaved superbly. Otherwise, I think that the two air ones look very different indeed. The wreckage in Lockerbie spread over, what, 50 miles? I don't know, some enormous amount. Whereas the wreckage here all concentrated together. That will at least make it easier to get the preliminary investigation mounted, because all the facts should be much easier to find, all the boxes, the recorders, everything else, not far away.
And of course, hopefully it will be possible to interview the crew as well.
Yes, I hope so. They've both survived, but obviously are not at all well.
One of the first planes to land at East Midlands Airport this morning was a flight from Belfast carrying friends and relatives of those who were on last night's crashed airliner.
The Queen has sent a message of sympathy to the victims' families. She said she'd been deeply shocked by the news of another major air disaster within 3 weeks of the Lockerbie crash. 26 of the passengers last night were Forces personnel going back to Northern Ireland after Christmas. The Army in Belfast say at least 4 soldiers were killed. The RUC too have said they had a number of officers on board. Many of the passengers' relatives have travelled to the East Midlands, where casualties are being treated in 3 local hospitals.
The ambulance is queued up on the now shut-off M1 motorway to take the injured survivors to hospital. Some of those they carried were only slightly hurt, others critically injured. 4 hospitals went on to full emergency footing to deal with the casualties in Derby, Leicester, Nottingham and Mansfield. Hospitals found themselves almost overrun by staff as doctors, nurses and others rushed in to give what help they could. The Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham handled a typical range of injuries.
We had 40 patients, as you already know. Of those, about 4 were unconscious head injuries when they arrived, and only 1 or 2 were in fact minor injuries, cuts, that sort of thing. And between that, there was a whole range of seriousness. There were a lot of nasty multiple injuries. 1 patient with 2 dislocated hips and a dislocated shoulder, 2 broken femurs, a nasty multiple injuries.
Most of the 80 survivors are too ill to tell what happened, but this morning Mr. Gareth Jones, a 38-year-old National Health Service worker from Bracknell in Berkshire, was well enough to meet reporters, under the very watchful eye of a hospital official.
Now, very, very gently, you can start asking questions.
Mr. Jones, could I ask you to tell us what happened last night?
Well, they just started serving the meals out, and I think where we were just on the leading edge of the wing. And there was a crash and a bang, and there were some sparks out the left-hand side of the plane. The pilot came through and said that he'd actually lost the right-hand side engine, and he'd asked permission to divert to East Midlands. As we were descending, you could see the lights, probably Derby or Nottingham, coming up out through the side, and the sparks on the left-hand engine started again. There was a shudder and a bang, and he just said, prepare for a crash landing. And there was a lady next to me who'd been very disturbed, and I shoved her head down so we were in the right position. And at that point we crashed, and I think that's where I picked up the shiner, because I didn't get my head down.
What do you remember about the actual impact of the crash?
There was just a shuddering crash, like a massive motor car accident, crunch, blackness, and I was by the emergency hatch. So I quickly could see there was a tree out there, so I knew we were down and we weren't still up in the air and coming down. So I pulled the hatch, a bit of trouble to start with, before I realised there was a top and a bottom handle, pulled those, shoved it out, grabbed the lady next to me and pulled her out. Got down onto the motorway and I was still standing, went back up again, pulled a bit of wreckage on and my legs gave way. Anything more than I know,
Mr. Jones' injuries are relatively minor, a bruised hip, a damaged ankle and chest pains. He may be discharged tomorrow. He's especially grateful to unknown drivers on the M1 who rushed to help.
There were an awful lot of people whose cars had stopped on the motorway, and they were very, very good. There was a young lady, Emily, I don't know what her surname was, stopped, and the ambulance men, and there was a Sikh gentleman, I think, put a blanket over me. She stayed with me, threw a coat over me, took my telephone number, and I know I spoke to my wife. She actually did ring and say that I'd been all right, and she'd put me on the ambulance.
One patient at Derby Royal Infirmary said people stayed calm when the captain announced an emergency landing. Dr. John McRae, travelling with his wife Josephine, saw alarming flashes from one engine.
So I took out the safety instruction card and I showed it to my wife, and I pointed out to her how she should brace her head and so forth. And I just said to her, well, you know, it could be bumpy, so why don't you do this just to be sure? And then we carried on, and the next thing I saw these flashes of light coming from the window and a bit more turbulence, as it seemed. And I wondered whether or not the engine had started to fire again, or whether this maybe would have been done. I don't know anything about planes to try and balance up the plane. But not long afterwards, the captain said, prepare for emergency landing, or something to that effect. So we braced our heads, and about 5 seconds, I would have said afterwards, we were down on the ground with a crash, all the lights were out, and we seemed to be at an angle of about 45 with the vertical. And at that time, really, there were a few people moaning in the cabin saying, oh, my legs hurt, somebody please help me, I think I've broken my leg. But there was no great pandemonium. And I think my worry at that stage was whether or not there would be a fire in the fuel tanks.
All I remember feeling was the plastic, the debris coming from the roof. I don't really remember seeing anything at the neck. I think we must have been out of the plane, and I remember seeing my husband standing and being grateful that he was standing, you know. But after that, I don't really remember anything.
Mrs. McRae sustained a broken thigh bone and a cracked pelvis. Her husband's injuries are less serious.
Well, I'm joined now from the scene of the crash by the Secretary of State for Transport, Paul Channon. Well, Mr. Channon, British Midland, as you probably have heard, have grounded a similar plane to the one that crashed. Yes. Do you think that's a sensible decision?
I'm sure that's wise till we have more information in the next few days.
I suppose, did they take this on their own initiative, or
yes.
was it from the orders of you?
No, they announced that voluntarily last night, so that they took that decision straight away. Well, I've been spending the morning with my air accident investigators, and I must say so far the evidence, although by no means conclusive, it's consistent with the right engine having stopped before impact, and there are also signs of fire in the left engine.
So it does seem almost certain then that both engines malfunctioned in some way?
That certainly looks probable at the moment.
There was no fire, and this seems to be the reason...
There was a fire in the left engine, we think.
But there was no fire in the fuselage. The wings
No.
didn't explode, did they? And this seems to be a reason a lot of people survived. Why didn't the wings explode?
Well, I think that the airport fire brigade was there within about a minute and a half and put out the fire that was existing in the port engine. This is what seems to have happened. So amazingly quickly that it never caught hold anywhere else, and I think that must have saved the lives of many people.
What form is the investigation now taking?
Well, my air accident investigators are beginning their work. The chief inspector has appointed one of his number to be the head person to deal with the matter here, and they have already made substantial progress.
Do you rule out terrorism?
I don't rule out anything at this stage, but there's certainly no evidence of it.
If both engines did fail, why couldn't the plane have glided into the runway, which was so close?
Well, I think we'll have to find that out later on, but I mean, it had to get over a big hill, unfortunately, before it got to the airport, and as you know, it crashed into the hill. But I mean, this is very tentative. We don't want to, it's very dangerous to speculate at this stage, but this is all very tentative at the moment.
Is it safe to fly in these planes with only two engines then, if they could lose both like this?
Well, it has historically always been thought safe to fly in planes like this with two engines. It's perfectly safe. If one engine fails, the other engine you are supposed to be able to fly perfectly safely and to land perfectly safely. Now, that is one of the questions that will have to be discovered in the inquiry.
Mr. Channon, thank you very much for joining us from the crash scene.
Thank you.
Well, as we've heard, crash investigators say the chances of both engines failing at the same time are many millions to one. British Midland's 737 was almost brand new, delivered just 12 weeks ago. It had flown less than 500 hours. The aircraft's pilot, Captain Kevin Hunt, was very experienced. He'd worked for British Midland for 25 years. The airline says it's ruled out sabotage, but says the probable cause of the crash was a technical fault in one of the engines.
This was the British Midland 737 arriving at Heathrow Airport yesterday afternoon, only a few hours before its final takeoff. It left Heathrow at 10 to 8 last night on the regular scheduled flight to Belfast. The first report of something wrong came at 8 o'clock, a fire in the starboard engine. London Air Traffic Control told East Midlands Airport to expect an emergency landing. The pilot then told the airport he had the fire under control. All airline pilots are trained on simulators to fly with a single engine. The training is especially important for pilots flying aeroplanes with only two engines, like the 737. Landings on a single engine are not uncommon.
Now, he had just converted to this aeroplane because it's a very new aeroplane, so he'd quite recently done all this sort of thing in the simulator and was quite used to flying the aeroplane around on one engine. The aeroplane is designed to fly well on one engine, and he was then in conversation with his company, and between them they decided to go to East Midlands. Unfortunately, just when he was committed to landing at East Midlands, he had a second engine failure, which is an unheard of event really, a most remote possibility, and virtually could do nothing but drop the airplane on the ground.
Reports from eyewitnesses that the second engine was alight came when the 737 was a few miles from landing at East Midlands Airport. At 26 minutes past 8, the jet crashed, hitting the M1 motorway as it came down.
How unusual is it to lose the power of both engines?
It is almost unheard of. I mean, the engines are separate, they're on separate wings, well, either side of the fuselage, well separated from one another. They have separate fuel supply, etc. It's very unusual for both engines to fail.
This was the brand new jet which crashed last night, pictured at Heathrow at the beginning of December. British Midland had taken delivery 2 months earlier. It was a 737-400, the latest version of the world's best-selling airliner, about 10 feet longer than its immediate predecessor. Since the first 737 flew in 1967, it's become the leader on short-haul routes like the London-Belfast run.
There are more than 2,000 of these airplanes ordered, more than 1,700 of them flying the world's skies at the moment. That is the most successful, most widely flown jet airliner in history. There isn't any evidence yet that the pilots have reason to be worried about this aeroplane.
But today there have been suggestions that some pilots have been concerned about the 737-400, the type which crashed last night. While based on a well-established aircraft, it is a new version, a point investigators will examine. They will also look at the 737's engines, the modern high-technology CFM56. It's produced jointly by General Electric in the United States and Snecma in France. It uses larger fans and is quieter and more economical than its predecessors. Although the CFM56 is a new engine for the 737-400, it's been used for several years on other aircraft, including the A320 Airbus and DC-8s. British Midland have one other 737-400. As a precaution, that's now grounded.
In this type of accident, as opposed to the one at Lockerbie, you can expect to get a great deal of very informative information out of the flight recorders. On top of which, of course, you have a surviving crew who provide a lot of information.
The investigation has already begun. British Midland say they've ruled out sabotage. The availability of evidence will make the investigators' job less difficult, but it will not be easy to find out why both engines failed with such appalling consequences.
With me now is Captain John Feasey of the British Airline Pilots Association, who's flown 737s for the past 5 years. And as with the pilot of the crash plane, Captain Feasey has been trained in emergency procedures for both engines failing on 737s. Well, we've heard it's a millions to one chance. What do you think went wrong? How did it happen?
I would only be speculating. It does appear that he was making an emergency approach on one engine, which is perfectly standard procedure, and the other engine failed at that point.
Is there any reason why the second engine should have malfunctioned at that particular point in time?
No, not that I know of. And of course the 737 will glide. You have an auxiliary